Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. and today I'm reviewing Monsterpocalypse from Privateer Press and Mythic Games. And this is a slightly complicated one to go into the backstory, but we will go into the backstory. Monsterpocalypse is a game that has existed since, I believe, 2008. It's a game that Privateer Press put out. It basically involves a bunch of monsters attacking each other, destroying buildings, destroying units, all that stuff. We'll get to the game overview shortly. But it existed in a bit of a collectible line, gathering different monsters, gathering different things one at a time, trying to collect your armies together. It was more of a collectible line with a board game style of play, which is where Mythic Games enters the picture. This game, soon to be or currently on Kickstarter, link in the description down below, Mythic Games is bringing you more of a pre-packaged version of this, giving you a bunch of monsters, a bunch of units, a bunch of buildings, all in one giant box, and then potentially others added on as well, other expansions, who knows what they'll be bringing to the table, but effectively making it more not just a board game in the style of play, but a board game in the packaging as well. Pre-assembled miniatures, new miniatures for replacement buildings, improved art to the various board and play arrays and different things, and some of the things you're seeing on the board are still in the older form, which is a good time to talk about the fact that this is sort of a prototype. By sort of a prototype means I'm covering a game that is simultaneously a finished product in one sense and a new product and prototype in another sense, depending on where you're looking at in the stages of what this game currently is, which is why this review is also kind of asterisks as a first impressions, because while my experience of Monsterpocalypse, the original game, is what I'm seeing here, the various new things that Mythic Games is bringing to the table, and many of those I have not had a chance to try out myself, many of those I haven't had a chance to fully dive into, and so to some extent it's a first impressions of what this game will be, while being a review of what this game was. If that wasn't confusing to you, if that was confusing to you, I apologize. It's a little bit of a backstory in terms of what's going on with the game. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead into this semi-prototype game review, or overview. Let's go for the overview first. Overview of the game I touched upon briefly already. This is a game where your main goal, there's going to be scenarios, different ways to play, but the main goal, effectively, a default scenario, vanilla 1-on-1, will be each opponent has their monster, each monster has their supporting units, and then you're trying to take your monster's health down to 0, more specifically your opponent's monster's health down to 0. You're going to do that by attacking them with your units, by attacking them with your monster, by picking up and hurling buildings across the board. Don't worry, that wasn't one of the plastic ones. Hurling buildings across the board to destroy others, hurling monsters into buildings, basically trying to reduce your opposing monster's health, your opponent's monster's health, down to 0 before they do the same to yours. That's all you're trying to do. Past that, the monsters have abilities, the units have abilities, many of the buildings, you'll see different types of buildings, many of the buildings have different abilities that will come into play as you secure those buildings with your units, because your units are basically, well, your supporting forces. They'll go ahead and get in the way of your opponent's monsters, making it harder for them to charge around the board. They'll get in the way by securing different buildings, giving you access to more power, giving you access to abilities. They'll actually take their time and sometimes just straight up shoot your opponents, whether the units or the monsters. Those are all your supporting, but also easily destructible forces. Then your monster comes into play, and they're a bit more of a threat. They're going to have their basic attacks, which honestly are fairly boring, and I don't like using them ever, but they will have their special attacks. Special attacks which involve them doing the fun part of the game, the parts where you pick up a monster and shove them into a building. Maybe Gorgahadra over here picks up a Defender X and slams them into this building, which will reduce that building down to this smoldering fire of a pit, and then I'm now on that building. I'll take a point of damage for the attack, a point of damage for hitting the building, and a point of damage for being on the smoldering wreckage over there. That's a 3 damage hit, and I won't be able to survive too many more of those. The flip side is I'll go ahead and grab Gorgahadra. I'll maybe go ahead on my turn and align with Gorgahadra, and then I'll pick up, let's say I'll go over here. No, I'll go over here. This is tricky. I won't be able to get the shot I want, but I'll go over here and maybe I'll toss Gorgahadra all the way this down with a power attack, killing one of his beasts along the way and also ending him on fire. So 2 damage to Gorgahadra, 1 damage to the creature, trying to do these different monster attacks. You'll pick them up, slam them into buildings. You'll throw them across the board. You will rampage through the board. Maybe in my next turn, I go ahead and just do a full charge through the building and through those beasts, taking them all down to nothing, and again, slowly destroying the board more and more. Meanwhile, Gorgahadra over there grabs me and throws me across the board into my unit, so I get thrown back here. That's what this game is doing. It's offering you the promise of just sheer destruction, destroying the landscape and units and everything else. This guy's probably dead by now. Destroying the landscape and units and everything else as you play through the game. The core activation structure is you'll choose whether to activate your monster or your units. You'll utilize dice to do so. Those dice will slowly move to the opposing pool. So as you activate your units, you move those dice to the monster pool. And as you activate your monster, you move those dice to your unit pool, which means at any given point, you're left with the option of having a very powerful, strong next turn that your opponent knows how to predict, or perhaps splitting your dice a little more, giving you some more flexibility, giving you the opportunity to react to what your opponent does, but with slightly weaker turns, because those dice, your actions, are in one pool or another, and you have to choose how you walk into your next turn. Rinse and repeat until your opponent's life is down to 0, and that is effectively Monsterpocalypse. Which brings us to the review part of everything, and before I do that, let's get into the game, my general preferences and biases as far as gameplay, mechanics, all those other things as far as this game. Now, like I said already, this is sort of a prototype, so factor that in. Some of the things I'm dealing with are prototypes from Mythic's soon-to-be game. Other parts are from the Privateer Press line, so again, it's a mix of what I'm touching and working with over here. Past that, this game does have powers and abilities, which in general is something I like in my games. I like character powers, of monster powers, of building powers. I like all that stuff in general in games. It's a miniatures board game, and I will say Mythic Games in general has some of the best miniatures that I think they have some of the best miniatures in board games nowadays, and yes, I am swayed by the pretty miniatures on the table. I do need good gameplay first, but miniatures, nice miniatures, do certainly give me a reason to pay attention to a game. And then lastly is I do have an ongoing reviewer relationship with Mythic Games, where I've been covering a bunch of their Kickstarters and prototypes, and so I do have that relationship with them. Not a paid relationship, to be clear, but nonetheless a relationship. And with that, let's go ahead and get into the various, well, everything of this review. Timestamps, as usual, in the description down below, or just in that little timeline bar thingy. Starting with art, theme, and narrative. In general, I like the art of this game. Now, you'll see over here, some things are the newer art, and some things are still the older art. So, for example, we have this little playmat under the table with my unit power and monster areas. That's all from the older art. You can go ahead to the Kickstarter, where you'll see the graphics for the newer art over there. This board, on the other hand, does represent the newer art that they're bringing to the general board of Monsterpocalypse, and that, very solidly done. These player cards over here, plus player aids for the monster attacks, all those things, this is all old over here, and the old game doesn't even have players for the monster attacks, so those are all going to be new things on the Kickstarter page. I've seen them already, I like them already, but you can't see them on the table here. So art in general, solid there. Component-wise, like I said already, this is full of shiny production little miniatures. These do look like they are sun-dropped a bit. I don't know if that's something, sun-dropped is technically Awakened Realms. These do look like they're pre-shaded. I don't know if that's something that Mythic Games will be offering on the Kickstarter. I believe they've done it in the past with Darkest Dungeon, and so it's likely that they'll do it here as well. But understand that if you want your miniatures to look like this, there may be an additional cost to get them there. And that table presence, the table presence that the miniatures, the table presence that the entire game has is completely off the chart. The fact that you start with this cityscape that is just full of buildings, and then those buildings slowly get destroyed, turned into rubble, monsters being flung across the board, little units being stomped on. The general aesthetics of this game are incredible. It is fun to set up. It is fun to, well, it's not fun to set up, but it's fun to have it set up, and it's fun to watch this building and cityscape of Metro City, or whatever we're going to call this, slowly being torn apart. And then, as far as narrative, I mean, there's a narrative here. I think some monsters have objectives, some monsters are coming from space, some monsters are defending Earth. I don't really care about any of that. This is a game where I'm here to roll dice and slam miniatures into buildings. As far as ease of play covers a variety of different factors, but first of all, this game is super easy to learn, meaning the actual rulebook is fairly wordier than I would think, but nonetheless, it's fairly easy to get through everything, and it covers a lot of extra stuff that you don't need for your actual basic introduction game, so it's fairly easy to get through the actual learning it yourself as someone who's diving into it, and it's even easier than that to teach somebody else. There's not a lot going on in this game. You have to teach people turn structure, you have to teach people the special attacks. Those are the most complicated thing to remember, at least until we have a player aid. Then there's some powers and abilities, and then just some minor interactions you have to be aware of. This is a game where you can get people up and running in 5 to 10 minutes fairly easily. Speaking of getting up and running, setup and teardown, despite what you see on the table, is very, very easy. Despite having all these buildings, there's really not a lot to set up. If you think of your standard Euro game with piles of tokens that have to go in certain places, you just have these buildings and you go ahead and put them on the table. Now, there's actually a bit of a draft way that you play, putting out your buildings one at a time. So even that will technically be part of the gameplay, but the setup and teardown of Monsterpocalypse is a breeze. This is a game that is easy to get up and running as far as all of that. And as far as playtime, this is a game that comes in the 30 to 90 minute range, depending on just how effective you're being, depending on how head-to-head versus defensive you're being, as well as depending on the player mode that you're bringing to the table, because there are a variety of different player modes, ways to bring more monsters, ways to play as teams, all that. Those things will affect the playtime, but I would say you're generally looking at between 30 to 90 minutes for a game. The one thing I would caution as far as ease of play, especially because this is a Mythic Games Kickstarter, is the more content you get, the more stuff you have for this game. I don't know what their plans are as far as any optional buys or the full pledge or stretch goals, all that. The more content you have for this game, the more you potentially make it slightly harder to table as you get that content. I am someone who likes the shiny, do not get me wrong, but if you have 4 boxes of who knows what and miniatures everywhere, this might be a game that you're a little less likely to table, especially if you're someone who wants everything in their own special place, as opposed to myself who callously dumps all the miniatures into a single box. But that's something I would caution as far as ease of play. Player count. Player count is a 1 to 4 player game. This is a game that can be played as a 1 player game with co-op scenarios where you can control the monsters fighting against an enemy AI monster, or it can be played as a 4 player game with team modes or free-for-alls or any of that. I have only played this as a 2 player game, which I believe is what it's primarily designed as. Mythic Games is focusing more heavily on really trying to dive into those other player modes, other player counts. For myself, I've only played this as 2, so I can't really comment on the experiences past saying that I definitely want to try the co-op mode, and I definitely want to try team modes, but I don't know how well they'd play and if they'd work or not work for this experience. For me, I've only really played this at 2. As far as highlights, nitpicks, and meaningful critiques. For highlights, there's a few different things. Starting off is the alternation between the units and the monsters. In general, like I talked about briefly already, when you take your actions, you're spending dice from your respective pools. Now the problem is, if I take a unit turn and I spend all 10 dice, all 10 of my actions, to activate my units, to spawn more units, to roll dice and attack, that means I will have a stronger unit turn. But it also means that going into the next turn, I can only activate my monster, and that gives you, the opposing player, more control over how the next turn will play out, over how defensive things will be, because you know what I can and can't do in the next turn. Or I can trade off and have slightly weaker turns, but constantly have the flexibility to deal with the world around me. And so balancing that little balance of your unit dice, your monster dice, where they end up, and which turn you're taking next, that adds a lot of strategy to how you play this out, a lot of decision space around when you just want to slam someone into the ground versus when you need to be a little bit more restrictive because you need to be able to react to whatever they do next. Secondly, the different types of buildings. The buildings give you something to focus on as far as giving your units a reason to address something. They're also going to earn you power dice when you secure these buildings, power dice that are essential for your monster to actually do those special attacks that I like so much. And so in general, the buildings and the variability of those buildings gives you something else to focus on, whether it's some way of healing, whether it's some way of dealing more damage, whether it's a way your units have more range, or whether it's you moving those dice back and forth. There's different options that the buildings will bring to the table, different abilities that they give to what's going on. And speaking of, well, abilities, the monster abilities, those monster special attacks are the core as far as what I like in this game. Or forget like, what I love in this game. Monsterpocalypse is a game that the main reason to play this game is if the idea of grabbing a monster and throwing them through 2 buildings into another monster, if that sounds fun to you, then this is that game. This is a game where you are doing that kind of things. You are destroying a city around you. And yes, you may have units that actually repair the city around you too, but for the most part, you are slowly self-destructing the city. You're smashing monsters into other units. You're smashing them into buildings. You're stomping the ground to destroy a whole bunch of frustrating units around you. You feel like and are acting like a monster, both for the strategic benefit as well as the sheer fun of doing a 4 or 5 damage attack when you shouldn't be able to do something like that. That, for me, is the main highlight of Monsterpocalypse. Just destroying the world around you. I'm a little hesitant to knock these ones down because those ones are plastic and a little heavier, so my casual tossing is a little more restricted there. But that's it. And you leave burning wreckage around you. You leave burning wreckage, which is then just as impactful because you can then do other things, causing more damage to opposing units or monsters with that burning wreckage around them. As far as nitpicks, some of the nitpicks are related to my experience versus how the game might be. So for example, play rates. I really, really want play rates for those monster attacks. As someone who was new to this experience, new to this game, my first few games involved me just grabbing the rulebook, flipping through to the pages of where we have those special attacks, and then reading through them again and again. It needs a good play rate, whether it's just a graphic and then you can reference the rulebook, or whether it's text, I don't care. It needs something that reminds me that what the special attacks are without me broadcasting to my opponent exactly what my next turn will be as I say, hey, could you pass me the rulebook? Because they know exactly what's going on. It slows down the game. It broadcasts my intent. This game needs good play rates. Secondly, some of the abilities that the various units and monsters have do just come down to rolling more dice, which while strategic, I find less interesting. So for example, over at Gorgohydra over here, one of their miniatures, I don't remember which one over here, is the crawler. The crawler over here, nope, not this one, maybe, yes, this crawler. The crawler has an ability where they just sit there and get in the way. They obstruct my opposing monster. I can't charge through them. I can't even pick them up and throw them the way I normally would. That provides a tactical benefit, a tactical ability that I really appreciate what it's bringing to the battle on the table. As opposed to some units, it just comes down to if you do X and Y, you roll more dice, which I find that less satisfying. It's strategic. It might help you win, but just rolling more dice I don't find interesting in this game. This is a game where the interesting parts are flinging people across the battlefield, and things that change the way the landscape works is far more interesting to me than whether I just roll an extra die or not. So I want to see more abilities that are intriguing as opposed to more abilities that come down to, well, stat increases. And that's true for the monsters as well. And then lastly, some of the monster fights, and this is relevant when you have a 1 versus 1 fight with the monsters, and there's multiple player modes available, but some of the monster fights, when you just have a 1 versus 1, can boil down to a bit of a back and forth. I slug you, you slug me. You slam me into this building, I pick you up and slam you into that building. There's different ways that it devolves a little bit into these back and forth fights with the monsters, where you slowly slug each other down to whatever health, and unless somebody chooses to run away and let their units get in that battle for them, it can devolve into a bit of a back and forth slugfest. As far as meaningful critiques for this, there's only really one, but it is a big one, especially depending on what you're looking for in a game, which is the game is lighter on the strategy. There are decisions to be made, don't get me wrong. There are definitely a lot of decisions to be made. The whole activation of the monsters of the units, lots to go on there. Management of your units, what you go for, which buildings you try to secure, which spawn zones you try to secure. There's a whole row of spawn zones in the center that as you move towards them, it allows you to spawn units closer to battle. Taking control of power points so you can generate stronger and faster and heavier hitting power attacks. There is a lot of strategy as far as the general positioning, as far as how to position your units that they are both annoying, because they are meant to be annoying, as well as actually dealing damage to your opponent, positioning those units so that you can retreat effectively, running away from battle, and then having these swarms of units come in to close the gap so you can recover and do what you need to do while your units handle the battle for you. There's a lot of strategy and choices to be made, but at the end of the day, all those things are true. All those trying to see if you can get a perfect line of 3 buildings you can throw someone through, those are all present. But at the end of the day, you're rolling a lot of dice, trying to slug somebody down to 0 health. This is a game that falls more into the category of a light, fun, beer and pretzels dice chucker with strategy, but still a light, fun, beer and pretzels dice chucker. As far as final thoughts for this game, it's hard to say exactly because of all the things I want to try additionally. Meaning, Monsterpocalypse in its current state is fun, it's exciting, it's interesting. But I want the other factions. I want to try the other abilities. I want to try the various combinations. I want to try a 3 versus 3 with different monsters on the table. I want to try the free-for-all. I want to try the Apex Predators. You see, check out the Kickstarter page. There are a lot of different co-op modes or options. There's a 2 versus 2. There's a cooperative mode where you fight against other monsters. There are Apex Predators that are some classic monsters that are being reimagined, each one being both a monster that you can fight as well as a monster that can fight against you, being stronger and badder and harder to take down and requiring more cooperation. They've streamlined the 3 versus 3 mode where you have 3 monsters against 3 monsters, giving you more monster badness on the battlefield as you toss and further deal other damages left, right, and center to the general cityscape around you and to the monsters. There are a lot of other play modes, abilities, factions, buildings, all those things that give me the reason to continue to dive back into Monsterpocalypse, and I need those reasons. Because base game alone, if you just give me 2 factions, 2 characters, 2 monsters, and going head to head, it's fun, it's light, it's great, but it's good for like 5 games. It's not good for 10, 15, 20 games because that beer and pretzels dice chucking you need something else to keep it interesting. And those other play modes, other monsters, and everything else are what's going to do that for me. That's basically it. That's Monsterpocalypse. You can check this one out over on Kickstarter. Like I said, link in the description down below. Until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. Hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, have a good one.